Chapter 7 of Daniel Boone, Backwoodsman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kurt from Tucson, Arizona. Daniel Boone, Backwoodsman by C.H. Forbes-Lindsay. Capture of Boone. With the opening of spring, the Indians, who had spent the preceding winter in preparation, burst upon the frontiers. Had they made a concentrated attack, with the aid of the British, upon the Kentucky settlements at this time, there can be little doubt that they would have succeeded in clearing the country of the buckskins, as they sometimes call the pioneers. Fortunately, they scattered their forces and directed their first attack mainly against the borders of Virginia and Pennsylvania. Sufficient numbers, however, assailed the 4 stations of Kentucky to tax the courage and resources of the defenders and to keep them in a constant state of disquietude. Men, women, and children were unremittingly alert, for the forests swarmed with skulking savages. Frequent attacks in force were made upon the stockades, which were from time to time subjected to the characteristically brief sieges of the Indian. The ground was tilled and crops were tended under guard. Scouts scoured the surrounding country and saved the settlers from many a surprise. During March, an attack was projected against Harrodsburg. About 4 miles from that place, the Indians came unawares upon a small party of whites, who were engaged in making a new settlement. One of these was killed, and another taken prisoner, whilst a lad named James Ray, whom we shall have further occasion to mention, contrived to make his escape and warn the settlers at the station. This intimation of approaching enemies, although it gave scanty time for preparation, enabled the defenders to gather their entire number within the fort and to beat off the Indians without any loss to themselves. At about the same time, a movement was made against Boonesboro, but there was small chance of that stronghold being taken by surprise. Aside from the ever-wakeful Boone, the station now had the advantage of the services of such splendid rangers as Kenton, the McAfee brothers, and other expert woodsmen who had recently come in. The approach of the foe was announced in good time, and when the Indians arrived within sight of the stockade, every rifleman was at his post awaiting them. On one side, Boonesboro was protected by the river, which the bravest warriors dared not cross in the face of the backwoods marksmen. On the other sides, open ground stretched for a sufficient distance to prevent near approach under cover. The Indian of the forest regions was accustomed to the tactics of the skirmisher and guerrilla. He would seldom fight in the open, but would take cover behind trees, stumps, bushes, or in long grass. The facility with which he could hide his body and the stealthiness of his movements sometimes proved an efficient offset to the superior gunplay of his adversary. On this occasion the savages besieged Boonesboro for several days, during which the attack and the defense took the form of a series of duels. On each side, vigilant eyes marked individuals on the other and patiently watched for an opportunity to shoot with fair chance of success. In such contests the backwoodsmen were sure to inflict the greater injury, provided they remained behind their stockades. But it was seldom possible to ascertain the loss of the Indians, because unless hotly pressed in flight, it was their custom to carry off their dead and wounded. The siege of a fort was usually raised after a few days. The redskin warriors lacked the patient determination necessary to the success of such an undertaking, and moreover, as they depended upon the country for their food supply, the attacking body was frequently weakened by the detachment of hunting parties. In the present instance, the Indians soon retired, having killed one of the settlers and wounded 4 others. It seldom happened that the Indian attacks were characterized by determination or concerted action. Large bodies were usually composed of detachments from several tribes and were led by a number of chiefs who acknowledged no superior. The will of the majority, as expressed in council, theoretically controlled the action of all, but as a matter of fact, a dissatisfied member often acted contrary to the decision of the allied chiefs in action. Furthermore, tribal discipline was very low at this time. Even such powerful chiefs as Cornstalk and Blackfish had difficulty in controlling the young braves, and less renowned leaders had hardly any influence over their followers. Hence, a band of Indians engaged in warfare was apt to break up in the most sudden and unexpected manner. A few months later, a more serious assault was made upon Boonesboro. Had they but known it, the Indians could have chosen a less propitious date than the 4th of July for such a venture, but it was on that day that a band of 200 warriors made its appearance before the fort. They seem to have been particularly anxious to reduce the place, which they doubtless knew was commanded by the great chief Daniel Boone. Detachments had been sent to make feints against the other stations, in order to prevent their extending relief to Boonesboro. At the outset, the whites came near to suffering what would have been an irreparable loss, not only to them, but to the settlers in general. On the morning after the arrival of the besiegers, Boone, being anxious to learn something of their numbers and disposition, left the stockade just before daybreak and made a reconnaissance of the Indian camp. The day dawned to find him still several hundred yards from the fort. He was picking his way cautiously, taking advantage of all the cover available, when an Indian discovered him. The redskin fired and hit Boone upon the ankle. Short of a mortal wound, nothing could have been more effective than this ill-aimed bullet. Boone fell to the earth heavily, and as he did so, his trusty rifle escaped from his grasp and flew to some distance. He was unable to rise and utterly helpless. The Indian, seeing his plight, advanced rapidly with uplifted tomahawk to dispatch him, and Boone calmly awaited what he believed to be his end. But the watchful eye of Kenton had noted the incident, and Boone had hardly fallen when the scout was outside the stockade and speeding towards the spot with the swiftness of the deer. As soon as the Indian came into the open, Kenton stopped, took aim, and at the moment that the redskin reached the side of his intended victim, sent a bullet through his brain. Kenton was now little more than 100 yards from Boone, but by this time a number of warriors had appeared at the edge of the clearing. There was not a second to be lost, and although he appeared to be rushing into the jaws of death, Kenton flung aside his gun and flew to the spot where Boone lay anxiously awaiting the issue. At the same instant, several Indians bounded forward, yelling and brandishing their weapons. They had advanced but a few yards when a dozen rifles in the stockade spoke, and 4 of the redskins fell. The others hastily regained cover and turned their weapons upon the gallant ranger, who was in the act of lifting Boone onto his serviceable leg. Half carried by his rescuer, Boone hopped slowly to the gate of the fort, while a shower of bullets played unceasingly around. The half-light favored the wounded man and his companion, who gained the shelter of the stockade without being touched. Boone was a reticent man, estimating his own deeds lightly and little given to bestowing praise on others. But the splendid courage, strength, and skill displayed by Kenton in this dashing exploit excited unwonted emotion in the great pioneer, and he expressed his admiration and gratitude in the warmest terms. He recognized in the young, debonair scout a man after his own heart, and one of his own kind. Ever after this episode, Boone and Kenton were the fastest friends. During the ensuing months, whilst his wound was slowly healing, Boone took up his quarters in the upper story of one of the blockhouses, where he could command the scene and direct the defense in case of another attack. But the experience of the Indians on this occasion, which included the loss of 7 of their number, appears to have cooled their ambition to take Boonesboro, and that place enjoyed a respite during the remainder of the year, although attacks were made at intervals upon other stations. Salt was always one of the prime needs of the settlers, as it had been when they dwelt farther back in the borderland. To secure it now from the coast towns was a matter of much greater difficulty than it had been then. Resort was had to the simpler method of manufacturing the coveted commodity from the waters of the salt licks in which the territory of Kentucky abounded. At first this was accomplished in a manner far from satisfactory owing to imperfect knowledge of the process and lack of proper utensils. But just about this time the authorities in Virginia sent out a number of kettles and 2 experienced salt makers. In view of the prospect of further hostilities and perhaps protracted sieges, it was determined to lay in a large stock of salt. The men of the station were divided into 2 parties, which were to go out in turns and manufacture the material. As there was less danger of attack by Indians in the dead of winter than later on, Boone decided to take command of the first party, so that he might be at the fort with the opening of spring. On the first day of the year 1778, Captain Boone, with 30 men and the necessary utensils, left Boonesboro and set out for the lower Blue Licks, 50 or more miles to the north. Here they established a camp and set to work. From time to time a small party was sent to the fort with the pack horses laden with salt. On their return they brought back supplies of parched corn and perhaps a few of the simple comforts that the hardy backwoodsmen looked upon almost in the light of superfluous luxuries. Thus the work progressed satisfactorily, and the 6 weeks' spell, at the end of which time the party was to be relieved, approached its termination. Of course, a considerable amount of meat was constantly needed to satisfy the appetites of 30 vigorous men. Boone, as the most expert hunter among them, undertook the duty of keeping the general larder supplied. The task was a thoroughly congenial one to him, which we cannot imagine salt making to have been. It was his habit to go out some miles from camp every morning, returning at the close of the day with as much game as he could carry, and often leaving a quantity to be sent after with a pack horse. One afternoon in the early part of February, Boone was making his way towards the lick after a successful hunt, when he suddenly found himself surrounded by 100 Indians. Not having seen a redskin for months, and knowing the unlikelihood of their presence in numbers at that time of year, Boone was perhaps not as keenly on the alert as usual. But in any case he could hardly have escaped his present predicament. He had not crossed the trail of the Indians, nor encountered any signs of them. They had seen him earlier in the day, and had secreted themselves about his return path. As soon as Boone was fairly within the circle of the ambuscade, the savages suddenly arose on every side and made at him. He took in the situation at a glance, and dropping the carcass with which he was encumbered, started to run with all the speed he could command. A few years before, Boone had been a match for the swiftest runners among the redskins, but he had now reached middle age, when the limbs of the best lose something of their supple agility. Moreover, he had spent the day in toilsome exertion without rest or food, whereas his pursuers were comparatively fresh. Still, he held his own for a while, and put the Indians to their utmost endeavor to overtake him. At length, however, seeing that further effort was useless, Boone stopped and surrendered, with a complimentary remark to the foremost braves to put them in a good humor. It was at once evident to Boone that the band which had captured him was upon the war-path, and their destination could be none other than Boonesboro. They knew of the presence of the party at the lick, and had, in fact, tracked the hunter from that place in the morning. As they journeyed thither, Boone's mind was busy with a consideration of the conditions and the best course to be followed under the circumstances. His judgment was remarkably sure, and his decisions unusually quick. Before they had arrived at the camp, he told the Indians that, if they would assure his men of kind treatment, he would order them to surrender without resistance. The proposition appealed to the savages, and they readily gave the required promise. When the scene of the salt-making was reached, the Indians secured to themselves all the advantage possible by surrounding the unconscious workmen, who were in an exposed spot before discovering themselves. When the Indians made their presence known, the whites were taken utterly by surprise, but they quickly seized their rifles, and no doubt would have made a stout though hopeless resistance had not Boone signed to them to restrain their fire. He then approached with an escort of his captors and informed his men that he had agreed to their surrender. The declaration elicited some murmurs, but so great was the confidence in Boone's resourcefulness and the wisdom of his conclusions that the men laid down their arms without further ado and agreed to accompany the Indians. This action of Boone's excited the censure of some of his fellow officers and the disapprobation of many of the settlers. These feelings continued to be evinced after the outcome had shown the wisdom of his course, and prompted Boone some time later to secure a court-martial of himself. The evidence produced before this body and the frank explanation made by Boone induced his honorable acquittal, and not only that, but his promotion to the rank of major. The considerations that moved Boone, who was the last man to avoid a fight when it could serve a good purpose, to surrender his command were as follows. The settlement of Boonesboro, weakened by the absence of half the garrison, was in no state to make a successful defense against a large number of the enemy, should they take it by surprise. That they would do so was more than probable, for the settlers were accustomed from long experience to consider themselves safe from attack in the winter months, when the Indians almost invariably rested and took refuge from the weather in their villages. Familiar as he was with the character and habits of the Indians, Boone calculated with confidence upon their abandoning their expedition and returning to their country in triumph with their prisoners. It was ever the tendency of these savages to repair to their towns after a great victory, to indulge in a celebration and in their customary vauntings and boasting. Boone thus deliberately sacrificed himself and his men for the sake of saving the settlement with its women and children. That they would soon learn what had happened and be put upon their guard he felt sure, for 3 of the party of salt makers were absent at the fort and would soon return. The event proved that all his calculations were justified, and the incident ultimately tended to the welfare of the community. The shrewdest among Boone's men began to divine their leader's purpose when the Indians turned their backs on Boonesboro, and with all possible speed took the direction of the Ohio. Up to this time, the Kentucky settlers had no definite knowledge of the location of the Indians' towns. It would have been well for the savages had this ignorance continued. In afterlife, Boone said, "It was a sorry day for the Indians when they captured me and my salt makers and showed us the way to their villages and the lay of their land." The prisoners were not subjected to any cruelty by the Indians, who were highly elated by their capture, and especially by having the renowned captain Daniel Boone in their power. They seem to have given the whites their fair share of food and to have allowed them a sufficiency of covering when they were camped at night. The captives were at a loss whether to accept this consideration as an evidence of friendly feeling, or a measure designed to keep them in good condition to stand extreme torture when they should reach their destination. Most of them knew the fickle and childlike temper of the Indian, and the uncertainty of any deductions that may be drawn from his behavior. Here we must leave Boone for a while, trudging through the snow-swept wilderness with philosophical readiness to accept with equanimity whatever fate might have in store for him, but with a determination to turn circumstances to the best account whenever opportunity should offer. End of chapter 7.